Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, March 14th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today will reach 85.5 degrees, with a low of 55.6. It is a warm day, and also a fun one, as it is Pi Day, so perhaps grab a treat while you catch up on the news. In this episode, we examine how the intensifying conflict with Iran is creating significant strain on the global economy. We will also look into why the administration is utilizing emergency wartime powers to facilitate oil drilling operations in California. Of course, we have several other important stories to cover as well, bringing you the latest updates you need to know. We have a full program for you today on Alex's News, so stay tuned. We begin this morning with the escalating conflict in the Persian Gulf, where the U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran has entered a dangerous new phase. Overnight, we learned that American forces launched a massive bombardment of Kharg Island, Iran's most critical oil export hub. Our reporter Ethan has been tracking every development. Ethan, walk us through what happened last night.
So late yesterday evening, President Trump posted on Truth Social that CENTCOM had carried out what he called a massive bombing raid on Kharg Island. That's a small coral island in the northern Persian Gulf, only about 5 miles long, but it's enormously important. CNBC and Al Jazeera both confirmed that the strikes hit air defense systems, a naval base, helicopter hangars, and the island's airport facilities. The president claimed the operation, quote, totally obliterated, end quote, every military target on the island, which he described as Iran's, quote, crown jewel, end quote.
Did the strikes hit any of Iran's oil infrastructure there? That island handles a staggering amount of crude.
That's really the key detail here. Despite more than 15 massive explosions heard across the Gulf, Al Jazeera and Iran's state news agency IRNA both report the oil facilities were intentionally left untouched. And we're talking about infrastructure that handles more than 90% of Iran's crude exports, roughly 7 million barrels a day. President Trump said he chose not to, quote, wipe out, end quote, those facilities for, quote, reasons of decency, end quote. But he made it very clear they'd be next if Iran keeps interfering with ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz.
That feels like a very deliberate threat hanging over Tehran's head. How does this fit into the broader campaign that started back on February 28th?
It's a significant escalation from where things began just over 2 weeks ago. Operation Epic Fury, that's the U.S.-led name, was coordinated with Israel's Operation Roaring Lion. The opening strikes were more surgical, focused on military and strategic targets. But since then, the campaign has broadened to hit Iran's core economic and military infrastructure, including targets in major urban centers like Tehran, Karaj, Isfahan, and Tabriz. Coalition officials say they've degraded roughly 90 to 95% of Iran's missile launch capabilities through what they're calling bomber pulses.
And those initial strikes on February 28th had massive political consequences inside Iran. Can you explain the leadership situation?
This is really one of the most seismic developments of the entire conflict. CBS News and other outlets confirmed that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed during that opening wave of strikes on February 28th. For about a week afterward, Iran was governed by an interim council that included President Masoud Pezeshkian and Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni AG. Then, on March 8th, the Assembly of Experts elected Mojtaba Khamenei, the late leader's son, as the new supreme leader.
So the son has stepped in. Is he fully in command at this point?
That's a real question mark. NPR and the Sunday Guardian have both noted that while Mojtaba holds the formal title, Pentagon reports suggest he was, quote, likely disfigured, end quote, and wounded in the same strikes that killed his father. He hasn't appeared publicly. 2 days ago, on March 12th, he issued an address that had to be read by a surrogate. In it, he vowed to maintain the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and continue retaliatory strikes against the coalition.
Speaking of retaliation, there was a pretty alarming statement from the Revolutionary Guard this morning. What are they threatening?
This came just today from the IRGC's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters. According to Al Jazeera and the Long War Journal, They issued a formal declaration that U.S., quote, hideouts, end quote, and military installations inside the United Arab Emirates are now, quote, legitimate targets, end quote. They've explicitly ordered civilians to evacuate areas near UAE ports and docks where American forces are stationed. That's a major escalation because it drags a country that's been trying to stay neutral directly into the crosshairs.
How has the UAE been responding to these threats? Are they seeing actual attacks?
They absolutely are, and the numbers are staggering. The UAE Ministry of Defense reports that its air defenses have intercepted more than 1,700 drones and 285 ballistic missiles since the war began just over 2 weeks ago. Today, debris from an intercepted threat actually fell onto a building in central Dubai. The IRGC is reportedly deploying advanced HIMARS missiles, a class of sophisticated cruise missiles and drones, specifically to target U.S. assets in the Emirates.
And yet the UAE keeps saying it's neutral. How does that square with what's happening on the ground?
It's a really uncomfortable position for Abu Dhabi. The UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs has stated it hasn't permitted its territory to be used for offensive strikes against Iran. But analysts at Chatham House point out what they're calling a conflict gap. Tehran treats the UAE as a co-belligerent regardless, because the U.S. maintains significant forces at Al-Dhafra and Al-Minhad air bases. So from Iran's perspective, the distinction between hosting American troops and participating in the war doesn't really exist.
Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. How effective is Iran's blockade right now?
It's devastatingly effective. CNBC and maritime tracking data show a near 100% drop in tanker transit through the strait. That's one of the most important shipping choke points in the world. Global oil prices spiked to roughly $126 per barrel earlier this month, and Brent crude futures are still hovering well above $100. We're talking about a full-blown energy crisis that's hitting markets worldwide, and analysts are warning the risk of a global recession is very real.
The human toll of this conflict must be enormous after more than 2 weeks of fighting. What do we know?
The numbers are deeply sobering. Iran's Ministry of Health, as cited by Al Jazeera, reports at least 1,444 people killed and 18,551 injured by U.S.-Israeli attacks. And those figures are just from the Iranian side. The strikes have expanded well beyond military sites into major population centers, so those casualty numbers are almost certainly going to keep climbing as the campaign broadens.
Is the U.S. showing any sign of pulling back, or is this looking like a longer commitment?
Every signal points toward a longer commitment. A U.S. official confirmed the deployment of 2,500 additional Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. On top of that, the USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship, has been ordered to the region from its base in Sasebo, Japan. Satellite imagery currently places it near Taiwan, which means it's roughly 1 to 2 weeks away from the Persian Gulf. That deployment strongly suggests the Pentagon is preparing for sustained operations and possibly even ground contingencies down the line.
What about diplomacy? Is anyone talking about a ceasefire or negotiations?
Not from the American side, at least not right now. President Trump has been dismissive of any negotiated settlement. He claimed on Truth Social that Iran is, quote, totally defeated, end quote, and seeking a deal. But he's insisted on what he called, quote, unconditional surrender, end quote, saying the U.S. needs to achieve a, quote, position of dominance, end quote, before any talks happen. So the door to diplomacy appears firmly shut for now.
So with Karg Island's oil facilities still standing but essentially held hostage, where does this go from here?
That's really the central tension of this conflict right now. The oil infrastructure on Karg Island is intact, but it's functionally useless because of the blockade and the explicit threat of future strikes. Iran has vowed to keep the Strait of Hormuz sealed and is now expanding its target list to include the UAE. The U.S. is sending more forces and refusing to negotiate. Analysts are describing this as a drift toward what they call total economic war, and with crude prices where they are, the consequences are being felt far beyond the Middle East. Every day without a diplomatic off-ramp makes the next escalation more likely.
Ethan, thank you for breaking all of that down for us. We've got another story coming up right after this. We turn now to a major clash between the federal government and California over offshore oil drilling. The Trump administration is invoking Cold War-era emergency powers to restart oil platforms off the Santa Barbara coast. Chloe has been following this story closely. Chloe, what exactly did the administration do here?
So yesterday, March 13th, President Trump signed an executive order declaring what he's calling a national energy emergency. According to the Los Angeles Times and the Seattle Times, the order uses the Defense Production Act to command the immediate restart of offshore oil platforms and pipelines in Santa Barbara County. Energy Secretary Chris Wright then directed a company called Sable Offshore Corp. To restore operations at a facility known as the Santa Ynez Unit. The whole argument is that this is a national security necessity tied directly to the war with Iran.
Let's back up on that. How did the Iran conflict create this energy crisis?
It starts with what happened on February 28th, when the U.S. and Israel launched a massive air campaign that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Iran retaliated almost immediately by officially closing the Strait of Hormuz on March 2nd. NPR and other global monitoring agencies have called this the largest supply disruption in history. We're talking about roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day suddenly blocked, which is about 20% of the world's total supply.
20% of global supply gone overnight is staggering. What has that done to prices here at home?
It's been brutal, especially in California. The New York Post reports that gas prices in the state have climbed to an average of $5.41 a gallon, and state lawmakers are warning they could blow past $8 if supply stays this tight. Nationally, crude oil has surged past $100 a barrel and actually peaked around $126 in mid-March. California gets hit harder than most states because its refineries have historically depended on the Persian Gulf for 20 to 25% of their supply, which is about triple the national average.
So the administration is saying Santa Barbara's oil platforms can help fill that gap?
That's the pitch. They say the Santa Ynez unit could produce between 50,000 and 60,000 barrels a day, and that it would specifically help stabilize the West Coast energy grid and fuel military installations. But critics aren't buying the math. CalMatters reports that output would only account for roughly 0.25% of total daily U.S. consumption. The administration's counter-argument is that California is essentially an energy island. So even a modest amount of local production could meaningfully reduce the state's unique vulnerability to Persian Gulf disruptions.
Now these platforms have been shut down for years. Remind us why.
This all traces back to the Refugio oil spill in 2015. The pipeline at the center of this, formerly called Line 901, ruptured and released 140,000 gallons of crude oil into the Pacific Ocean. It killed hundreds of birds and marine mammals and became one of the worst environmental disasters in the region's history. The infrastructure has been dormant ever since. Sable Offshore, which is a Houston-based startup, bought the assets from ExxonMobil in 2024 and has reportedly spent about $211 million on repairs and upgrades.
$211 million is a lot of money. So why hasn't the pipeline been allowed to reopen?
Because Sable still hasn't obtained the necessary safety approvals from California's state fire marshal. The company has been fighting through the courts for months. As recently as February 27th, just a couple of weeks ago, Santa Barbara County Superior Court Judge Donna Geck upheld a preliminary injunction blocking the restart. She ruled the pipeline has to stay shut until all state-level safety reviews are completed. So that's the legal backdrop the federal government is now trying to bulldoze through.
And that's where the Defense Production Act comes in. How is the administration using it to get around that court ruling?
This is really the heart of the whole conflict. On March 3rd, the Department of Justice issued a legal opinion arguing that the Defense Production Act gives the president authority to preempt state safety laws and even override federal consent decrees when they obstruct national security objectives. It's a novel and, frankly, aggressive interpretation that legal scholars are already debating. CalMatters reports the federal government is also trying to reclassify this infrastructure as an interstate pipeline, which would shift jurisdiction from Sacramento to Washington, D.C., essentially cutting California regulators out of the picture entirely.
What specific state laws would this override?
We're talking about major pieces of California environmental law. The California Coastal Act, for one, which has been the backbone of coastal protection since the 1970s. There's also SB 237, the Pipeline Safety Act, which requires rigorous environmental reviews and safety upgrades that Sable has not yet completed. The federal argument is basically that wartime necessity trumps all of it. But California officials say there's no precedent for using the Defense Production Act this way against a state's own safety regulations.
How has Governor Newsom responded?
He's been furious. He called it, quote, a revolting power grab, end quote, and said the administration is making an, quote, illegal, end quote, attempt to, quote, poison our beaches, end quote, for the benefit of, quote, oil industry friends, end quote. California Attorney General Rob Bonta has pledged immediate litigation to block the order. His core argument is that the Defense Production Act does not grant the executive branch what he calls police powers to simply ignore public safety mandates. This is shaping up to be one of the most consequential federalism battles we've seen in years.
Where does the case stand right now, as of today?
It's escalating fast. The case is heading toward the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. California is preparing an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order to keep everything frozen. But on the other side, Sable Offshore has already notified local officials that it intends to begin transporting oil within 24 hours. So there's a very real possibility of a direct standoff between a federal order to operate and a state order to stop.
Has Wall Street weighed in on any of this?
Oh, absolutely. Sable Offshore's share price jumped by as much as 34% after the executive order was announced. Investors are clearly betting that the federal government will prevail, at least in the short term. But there's a lot of risk baked into that bet, because if the Ninth Circuit sides with California, that stock could come crashing back down just as quickly. The market reaction tells you how high the financial stakes are on top of everything else.
What about environmental groups and local elected officials? Where do they come down?
They're firmly in opposition. The Center for Biological Diversity is on high alert and expected to join the legal fight. Democratic Representative Salud Carbajal, who represents the Santa Barbara area, has been especially vocal. He says the project overrides the will of his constituents and poses a massive ecological risk for what he argues would be a negligible impact on gas prices. His point echoes what CalMatters found, that we're talking about less than 1/3 of daily national consumption. So the question becomes whether that fraction is worth the environmental gamble.
So big picture, Chloe, what should listeners be watching for in the days ahead?
The Ninth Circuit's decision is really the whole ballgame right now. If the court sides with the federal government, it would set a dramatic precedent that wartime emergency powers can override state environmental protections. If it sides with California, the administration would likely appeal, potentially setting up a Supreme Court showdown. Meanwhile, the physical reality on the ground is that you've got a pipeline the state says isn't safe, sitting right alongside a federal order demanding it be turned on immediately. It's a genuine constitutional standoff, and everything hinges on what the appeals court does next.
A story we'll be following very closely. Chloe, thanks for walking us through all of that.
Happy to do it, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. President Trump is looking to hammer out a new foundation for the housing market. On Friday, March 13, 2026, the Commander-in-Chief signed 2 executive orders aimed at building up the American dream ahead of the upcoming midterm elections. The first order, titled Removing Regulatory Barriers, looks to nail down costs by cutting green building codes, simplifying environmental reviews, and urging local governments to put their permitting processes on the fast track. The second, Promoting Access to Mortgage Credit, instructs the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to give community banks more room to breathe, hopefully sparking some healthy lending competition. While the White House claims these moves could shave $30,000 off construction costs, Experts wonder if the $398,000 median home price will really budge. Meanwhile, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are getting a $200 billion bond purchase boost to keep the momentum going. Out west, Oregon's legislature is facing a bit of a recount in the court of public opinion. Lawmakers recently passed House Bill 4018, a measure that critics argue is a total shell game for campaign finance. Despite 78% of voters backing contribution limits through Measure 107, this new bill effectively doubles donation caps by switching from an election cycle to a per-year basis. It also lets donors use multiple limited liability companies to bypass the rules entirely. While contribution limits are still slated for 2027, stricter transparency requirements have been pushed all the way back to 2031. The bill now sits on Governor Tina Kotek's desk, leaving advocates like Honest Elections Oregon wondering if the state is simply Portland airing to wealthy donors. Things are heating up on the Korean peninsula as Pyongyang decided to launch a 10-missile salvo of unidentified ballistic missiles from the Sunan area. This rocketing tension saw the projectiles travel 340 to 350 kilometers at an altitude of 80 kilometers before splashing down outside Japan's exclusive economic zone. This is the third launch this year, served as a direct protest against the 11-day Freedom Shield military exercises. Even as the missiles fly, President Trump has expressed interest in renewed dialogue with Kim Jong-un, while Japan's newly elected Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi faces her first major trial by fire. In a truly shocking escalation, the Kyiv region was struck by a massive Russian bombardment involving 430 drones and 68 missiles. Mykola Kalashnik of the Kyiv Regional Military Administration reported that the strike targeted energy infrastructure across 4 districts, including Brovary and Vyshhorod. The attack killed 4 residents and wounded 15 others, triggering emergency rolling blackouts. With peace talks in Geneva currently stalled due to the escalating conflict in the Middle East, Ukraine is left grappling with a diplomatic vacuum and a very literal power struggle. Finally, the world of sports is facing some foul play. The World Anti-Doping Agency is considering barring President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance from the upcoming World Cup and the 2028 Olympics due to $7,300,000 in unpaid U.S. dues. To add to the offsides drama, the president has suggested Iran's national soccer team should stay home, leading to boycott threats. With fewer than 90 days until the first whistle, security for the 11 host cities is feeling the squeeze due to fragmented intelligence and significant federal funding cuts. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.